The world saw him as just another African in a hoodie, until the military saluted him as president. When Ibrahim Traore boarded that Air France flight, he was treated as someone who didn't belong. What the flight attendant couldn't see beneath his simple clothes was the quiet power of a man who led a nation. Her discrimination targeted the wrong passenger, and now the consequences would echo across 2 continents. Witness the moment when colonial attitudes crashed against African sovereignty. Subscribe now to see how ordinary moments can change history. This story is just the beginning of our journey exploring power, dignity, and the changing face of global politics. The first light of dawn painted the Charles de Gaulle Airport in shades of gold and amber. The terminal was a sanctuary of calm before the day's chaos, quiet, peaceful, and crisp with morning chill. Near Gate 43, Ibrahim Traore sat alone, scrolling through messages on his phone. No entourage surrounded him. No security detail hovered nearby. No official pins or badges marked his status. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a navy hoodie, and well-worn leather shoes. His demeanor was relaxed yet alert, his eyes occasionally scanning the growing crowd with the practiced awareness of a man who understood power without needing to display it. To the casual observer, he was just another African traveler waiting for his flight home. But Ibrahim Traore was not ordinary. He was the president of Burkina Faso, a leader who had risen through military ranks to guide his nation through turbulent times. Unlike many heads of state, he preferred traveling without fanfare. No red carpets, no press, no diplomatic protocol. Just a man returning home after diplomatic meetings in Europe where he had advocated fiercely for his country's sovereignty and resources. As boarding time approached, Traore gathered his single carry-on bag and joined the line. He nodded politely to the gate agent, exchanging a brief, "Bonjour, comment allez-vous?" The young man smiled back, completely unaware that he was greeting a president. Traore savored these moments of normalcy, these small windows where he could exist as just a man, not a symbol or an office. Walking down the jet bridge toward the Air France flight bound for Ouagadougou, Traore mentally prepared to return to his responsibilities. Meetings with ministers, decisions about national security, plans for strengthening Burkinabe infrastructure. But for the next 6 hours, he would enjoy this rare privacy, this temporary anonymity that reminded him of the citizen he had been before becoming president. Ibrahim Traore moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death and survived. Before becoming president, he had commanded troops, navigated political minefields, and witnessed the best and worst of humanity. His resilience wasn't something he wore openly. It resided in the steady gaze of his eyes, the measured cadence of his speech, the deliberate nature of his movements. His path to leadership hadn't followed conventional routes. Born in a modest home, educated both locally and abroad, he had risen through merit rather than connections. Unlike politicians who inherited power, Traore had earned his authority through demonstrated capability and unwavering commitment to his people. When his nation faced crisis, he had stepped forward without hesitation. What distinguished Traore from many world leaders was his refusal to become distant from ordinary citizens. He regularly walked the markets of Ouagadougou unannounced, ate at local restaurants, and listened directly to people's concerns. His security detail had learned to adapt to this approach, maintaining distance while keeping watch. This connection to everyday life wasn't a political strategy. It was essential to his understanding of governance. Despite his position, Traore maintained humility as a discipline. He collected no luxury watches, owned no foreign villas, and kept his wardrobe modest. When foreign dignitaries showered him with expensive gifts, he redirected them to national museums or charity auctions. His opponents mistook this simplicity for weakness, not recognizing the iron will beneath the unassuming exterior. When facing international pressure from former colonial powers, multinational corporations, or global financial institutions. Traoré displayed a particular skill: strategic patience. He would listen carefully, speak precisely, and yield nothing of importance. Foreign officials often left meetings believing they had secured his agreement, only to discover later that he had protected his nation's interests while appearing cooperative. If Traoré had a weakness, it was his occasional tendency toward solitude. Though charismatic in public settings and warm with colleagues, he guarded his private thoughts carefully. His closest advisors respected his need for periods of reflection, understanding that his measured decisions emerged from these quiet moments of contemplation. History would remember many things about Traoré's presidency: his economic reforms, diplomatic realignments, infrastructure projects. But those who worked with him would remember something different: his capacity to remain unchanged by power. While authority corrupted many leaders, elevating them to ivory towers of isolation and arrogance, Traoré maintained his groundedness, his connection to ordinary reality, his sense of service rather than entitlement. The business class cabin welcomed Traoré with its familiar hush of privilege: the soft leather seats, the attentive service, the carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity. He settled into seat 2A by the window, stowed his small bag, and returned to reading policy briefings on his phone. The cabin gradually filled with executives, diplomats, and affluent tourists, none paying particular attention to the unassuming African man by the window. At the gate, however, a different scene was unfolding. Victor Beaumont, CEO of Energy Pro, one of Europe's largest energy conglomerates, arrived flanked by two assistants carrying his leather briefcase and travel documents. His tailored suit, signet ring, and commanding presence announced his status before he spoke a word. When informed that business class was fully booked, Beaumont's expression hardened with disbelief. "There must be some mistake," he stated coldly to the gate agent. "Check again. I always fly business class to Ouagadougou." The gate agent, a younger woman named Sophie, tapped nervously at her keyboard while Beaumont's impatience radiated like heat. His company held significant contracts in West Africa: resource extraction, energy infrastructure, government partnerships worth millions of euros, and he considered these accommodations non-negotiable. Sophie's supervisor arrived, apologizing profusely while explaining that the flight was completely full in business class. "Perhaps we could arrange something on board," the supervisor suggested, already radioing ahead to the cabin crew. Beaumont nodded curtly, expecting the problem to be solved as most obstacles in his path usually were, through deference to his position and influence. Aboard the aircraft, senior flight attendant Elise Moreau received the message about the VIP waiting at the gate. With 20 years of experience serving elite travelers, she understood the unwritten hierarchies of air travel: who received extra attention, who could be inconvenienced if necessary, who belonged in premium cabins, and who didn't. Without hesitation, she began scanning the business class manifest, looking for passengers who might be relocated to accommodate Beaumont. Her eyes moved methodically through the cabin, assessing each occupant against her internal criteria of importance. When she noticed Traoré, dressed simply, traveling alone, African, her decision crystallized immediately. Her experience had taught her that certain passengers would comply without complaint, would accept relocation rather than cause a scene. She approached with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Monsieur, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone politely firm. Traoré looked up, nodded once, and handed over the document. Elise examined it briefly, her smile fixed in place as she formulated her strategy. The boarding pass was legitimate, the seat assignment correct, but in her calculation, this passenger was the optimal candidate for displacement. "Monsieur, I apologize for the inconvenience, but we need to make a seating adjustment," Elise began, her voice honeyed with insincere regret. "Would you be willing to relocate to our premium economy section?" We would certainly provide compensation for the change. She stood expectantly, accustomed to compliance, especially from passengers who matched her profile of those less likely to resist. Traoré listened attentively, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but direct. May I ask why I specifically am being asked to move when my boarding pass assigns me to this seat? The question hung in the air between them. Reasonable, straightforward, impossible to answer truthfully without revealing the underlying assumptions guiding her selection. Elise shifted slightly, maintaining her professional facade. It's simply an operational decision, monsieur. We have a situation that requires adjustment. The vagueness was deliberate, designed to discourage further questioning while implying official airline procedure rather than personal discretion. Around them, other business class passengers began to notice the exchange, some watching openly, others pretending absorption in magazines or devices. I understand operational needs, Traoré replied, his tone remaining measured despite the obvious discrimination. However, I purchased this seat, checked in accordingly, and would prefer to remain where I was assigned. His response was neither angry nor confrontational, simply a firm assertion of his right to the service he had paid for. The quiet dignity in his refusal created a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Elise's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She was unaccustomed to resistance, particularly from passengers she had prejudged as compliant. I must insist, monsieur. We need to accommodate priority passengers. The mask slipped just enough to reveal the hierarchy she was enforcing, that some travelers were priority, while others, regardless of their ticket, were dispensable. Traoré didn't immediately respond, instead observing as Elise moved to approach another African passenger several rows behind him. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. She repeated her request to a young businessman from Mali, then to a Senegalese doctor, targeting only black passengers while ignoring others who might be relocated. Each selection revealed not operational necessity, but systematic bias. The young Malian businessman, Thomas Diallo, looked bewildered as Elise requested his boarding pass. Why am I being asked to move? He questioned, glancing around the cabin. Before Elise could respond, Traoré rose from his seat, his presence suddenly commanding attention despite his unassuming appearance. The question, he said clearly enough for nearby passengers to hear, is why only passengers with our skin color are being considered for relocation. The cabin fell silent. Elise froze, color rising to her cheeks as she realized the pattern of her actions had been named aloud. Several white passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of the discrimination unfolding before them. Thomas Diallo looked between Traoré and Elise, understanding dawning on his face as he recognized the systematic nature of what had appeared to be a random inconvenience. That's not... We're simply following procedure, Elise stammered, her composure cracking for the first time. The excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. Procedure didn't explain why she had bypassed dozens of other passengers to target only those with dark skin. She stepped back, suddenly uncertain, and retreated toward the galley where she could be seen whispering urgently to other crew members. Traoré returned to his seat, outwardly calm, though internally alert to the developing situation. He hadn't raised his voice or made accusations beyond the observable pattern. Yet his simple observation had disrupted the routine discrimination that might otherwise have proceeded without acknowledgement. Thomas and the other targeted passengers remained in their assigned seats, watching warily as the crew conferred in hurried whispers. Minutes later, Beaumont boarded the aircraft, escorted personally by the purser. He moved down the aisle with the confident entitlement of someone who expected accommodations to materialize regardless of circumstances. Elise immediately approached him with a deference bordering on servility. "Monsieur Beaumont, welcome aboard. We're arranging your seating now." She offered him champagne while he waited, treating his inconvenience as vastly more significant than the dignity of the passengers she had attempted to displace. The purser approached Traoré directly, adopting a more authoritative tone than Elise had used. "Sir, we must insist you relocate. This is now a security concern." The escalation was transparent. When discrimination had been called out, it was reframed as a security issue. The implicit threat was clear: comply or face consequences beyond mere inconvenience. The strategy was designed to intimidate, to make an example of the passenger who had dared to resist. Traoré met the purser's gaze steadily. "I have created no security concern. I have simply remained in my assigned seat and questioned why only black passengers were being asked to move." His voice remained measured, his demeanor calm. "If you wish to remove me from this flight for that reason, you are welcome to do so. But I would advise considering the implications carefully." The standoff continued as boarding completed and departure time approached. The cockpit crew, now informed of the situation, faced a decision: delay the flight to forcibly remove passengers who were rightfully seated, or find another solution for Beaumont. The captain, a veteran pilot named Marcel Dubois, left the cockpit to assess the situation personally, recognizing the potential for escalation if handled poorly. Captain Dubois quickly grasped the nature of the conflict and the discriminatory pattern that had created it. Unlike Elise, he understood that the reputational damage to Air France from removing black passengers to accommodate a white executive would far outweigh any benefit from appeasing Beaumont. With calm authority, he approached the CEO directly. "Monsieur Beaumont, I apologize, but business class is fully booked. We can offer you our highest level of service in premium economy today." Beaumont's face darkened with anger. "This is unacceptable. Do you know who I am? My company has contracts worth millions in Burkina Faso." His voice carried through the cabin, drawing attention from passengers throughout business class. The sense of entitlement was palpable, as was his assumption that his economic leverage should guarantee preferential treatment regardless of circumstances. "I understand, sir," Captain Dubois replied evenly. "But I cannot remove properly ticketed passengers from their assigned seats. The flight is departing shortly. What would you prefer to do?" The redirection was subtle but effective, transforming the situation from a demand the crew must satisfy to a choice Beaumont must make. Either accept the available accommodation or wait for another flight. After a tense moment, Beaumont grudgingly accepted the premium economy seat, though not without a final display of displeasure. "This is the last time I fly Air France," he declared loudly. "I'll be speaking to your corporate office about this treatment." He followed a flight attendant to his reassigned seat, leaving behind an atmosphere of lingering tension in the business cabin. As the aircraft doors closed and preparations for departure began, Elise avoided eye contact with Traoré and the other African passengers she had targeted. The discrimination had been interrupted but not acknowledged, creating an uncomfortable awareness among all who had witnessed the incident. For Traoré, this was familiar territory. The subtle biases faced by Africans in international spaces, regardless of their status or achievements. The flight departed Charles de Gaulle Airport and climbed to cruising altitude. The service routine began, though Elise delegated another attendant to serve Traoré's section. The small gesture of avoidance spoke volumes about her discomfort at having her actions exposed. Throughout the cabin, conversations occasionally turned to the incident, with some passengers expressing quiet support for the dignified resistance they had witnessed. 6 hours later, the aircraft began its descent into Ouagadougou International Airport. Passengers prepared for landing, gathering belongings and completing arrival forms. From his window seat, Traoré observed the familiar landscape of his homeland emerging through scattered clouds. The red earth, the urban sprawl of the capital, the markers of both challenge and progress that defined Burkina Faso. What no one aboard could see from the air was the unusual activity on the tarmac below. A formation of black SUVs with diplomatic flags had positioned near the terminal. Honor guards in formal military dress stood at attention in the sweltering heat. High-ranking ministers waited solemnly, having been informed of their president's return on this commercial flight. The ordinary arrival area had transformed into a presidential reception. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, passengers began noticing the unexpected welcoming committee through their windows. Murmurs of curiosity spread through the cabin. Is that a military guard? Who could be arriving? Is there some official visit today? The questions multiplied as the full extent of the ceremonial reception became visible, clearly prepared for someone of great importance. Beaumont, seeing the display from his premium economy seat, assumed it must relate to his business delegation. Finally, some proper recognition. He remarked to his seatmate, "Our energy projects are critical to this country's development." The misplaced confidence would soon collapse spectacularly, though he couldn't yet imagine how completely his assumptions would be overturned. The aircraft doors opened, and before regular deplaning could begin, a tall military officer in formal dress uniform boarded the plane. Major Laurent Zida moved purposefully through the aircraft, scanning faces until he reached seat 2A. There, he stopped and rendered a crisp military salute. "Welcome home, Mr. President," he announced formally. "Your ministers await your arrival." The revelation rippled through the cabin like an electric current. Passengers gasped, whispered, turned to stare at the unassuming man they had flown beside for hours. Elise, preparing the cabin for deplaning, froze in place, the color draining from her face as she realized the magnitude of her error. The passenger she had targeted for removal, whose dignity she had attempted to compromise, was the president of Burkina Faso. Traoré acknowledged Major Zito with a nod, gathering his single bag as he prepared to depart. He had revealed nothing of his identity during the flight, had claimed no special treatment, had simply stood on principle when faced with discrimination. Now, as his true position became apparent, the power dynamic in the cabin shifted dramatically. The authority that had been invisible but present throughout the journey was suddenly undeniable. The presidential motorcade departed the airport under military escort, leaving behind a scene of confusion and consequence. Elise and Captain Dubois were detained by Burkinabe authorities for questioning regarding their treatment of the president. Beaumont, attempting to slip away unnoticed, was intercepted by immigration officials who suddenly found irregularities with his business visa that required immediate resolution. Word of the incident spread rapidly through diplomatic channels and social media. Within hours, Air France headquarters in Paris was deluged with inquiries from international press. Videos taken by passengers showed the moment of revelation, the stunned expressions of the crew, the quiet dignity with which Traoré had conducted himself throughout. Hashtags like "Je respect Africa" and "Juice no colonial mindset" trended globally. At the presidential palace, Traoré addressed a hastily assembled press conference with characteristic restraint. "What happened today is not about me personally," he stated calmly. "It reflects attitudes that many Africans face daily in international settings. The time when Europeans could determine who belongs in which spaces and who must give way. That time is finished. Africa's dignity is non-negotiable." The consequences unfolded rapidly across multiple fronts. Air France issued a public apology, announced an internal investigation, and placed several staff members on administrative leave. Beaumont's company watched their stock price decline as investors questioned their African strategy and leadership. Most significantly, the Burkinabe government announced a comprehensive review of all foreign business contracts, with particular scrutiny of those negotiated under terms unfavorable to national interests. For ordinary citizens across Africa, particularly young people, the incident became symbolic of a larger struggle for respect and recognition. Social media filled with personal stories of similar experiences, of being asked to move, to wait, to accept less than what had been promised or paid for. Traoré's quiet resistance offered a template for maintaining dignity without escalation, for holding ground without becoming bitter. In the weeks that followed, Traoré never mentioned the incident again in public statements, returning to his focus on governance, security challenges, and economic development. Yet something subtle had shifted in both domestic and international perceptions. Foreign diplomats, who had previously underestimated him, approached with new caution. Counterparts who had dismissed Burkina Faso's positions found them advanced with firmer resolve. The lesson resonated far beyond the confines of that Air France cabin. True power doesn't need constant display. It resides in unshakable dignity, in principled stands, in the quiet confidence that justice, when deferred, is not necessarily denied. Ibrahim Traore had boarded the aircraft as a passenger refusing discrimination. He had deplaned as a president, demonstrating sovereignty. The difference was merely one of recognition. The power had been present all along,